Hey guys, welcome back to another Default Cube CG Matter tutorial, and the first thing you're probably thinking before we even get into this is why are you in a dark room? And to be honest with you, I have no idea. It's just very late at night, and I thought, you know what, let my voice carry you through this tutorial. Don't need to focus on my beautiful face. What we want to kind of focus on, rather, is just everything I'm showing you here in Blender. So, what is it that I'm going to show you how to make? Well, it looks like I'm showing you how to make a cone, which is kind of like a stupid tutorial. It's very simple to model, fairly simple to shade, but there is a twist. There is a reason I'm making this not only a tutorial, but a tutorial series, and that is that this cone is actually just a plane. I know, crazy stuff, and some of you might have no idea what I'm talking about. How is the cone actually a plane? What's actually going on here is we have a single plane, and all this geometry, all this shading, everything you're looking at is actually derived from this node network, which I can make full screen. It's derived from this node network, and if you haven't seen this before, it can look like black magic. It's like, oh, how do you, first of all, even deform the geometry, and second of all, how do you make something complicated with it? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today, I guess, and it's kind of like a useless art in some sense. It's like, why wouldn't you just want to model the cone? In this case, it is kind of useless. There are advantages, like, for example, I could, like, change certain aspects of this, like the cone radius. So here I'm making it a very thin cone, and it kind of breaks the geometry a bit, but you just need more divisions. So I can change something like that. I can distort the stripes on it. I could change a lot of aspects of this, and that's one benefit of this, what is called the procedural workflow, where we can control everything at any time. Nothing's baked in. That's one advantage, but the other advantage is that just knowing how to do this will help you out with a bunch of different projects, right? So this thing is rather useless, right? Making a cone out of nodes, but what you're going to learn here will apply to things that are actually useful. So generally, the cone is actually a fairly simple example. Once you know what you're doing, you're like, oh, a cone's actually not that bad, and that's why I picked it. But if you haven't touched nodes before, I can imagine this will not feel very simple at all. It kind of feels like an advanced topic, so I'm going to try to break this down in a beginner fashion, and I think I've gone over enough intro. So basic idea is we're going to make a cone procedurally out of shader nodes, and I'm going to try to explain it as slowly as possible. So this is the Blender scene I'm going to start off with. Probably you're going to start off with the same one. I'm using Blender version 2.9, I believe. Yes, the 2.9 alpha, which now might be in beta, I don't know. Older versions of Blender work. Newer versions, if you're watching this in the future, of Blender will also work. Do not worry about this. The only thing that matters is we need to be in cycles. And this is actually super important because the main idea, one of the main ideas of making this cone is going to be displacement, taking a plane and deforming it. And this only works in shading if you're in cycles. Does not work in Eevee. So cycles, and then just pick whatever settings you want beyond that. So I'm going to use my GPU. To start off, I'm just going to take this cube and replace it with a plane, since this is what we want to convert into a cone. Technically, you could do it with a cube, but I think this is actually much simpler. I'm also going to turn on experimental mode and add a subdivision surface, which kind of smooths this out, right? If we enable more divisions and all this, which I'm not going to do right now, although we could like increase the levels. It will make it smoother. We do want extra divisions, however, we do not want this smoothing, so just click simple, and this will kind of divide it without changing the overall form of it. So again, add a modifier of subdivision surface, set it to simple, and if you have experimental mode enabled, like I do, you're going to have this feature for adaptive, which you want enabled. This basically says, don't subdivide by a certain amount, just subdivide depending on how close it is to the camera. So here it's going to be very subdivided, whereas if I go further away, not so much, because you need less geometry because it's taking up less of the screen. This is just basic setup. Now in the shading workspace, which is where we're going to be spending our time, one more thing we need to do before we can actually get started. So I'm just going to make a new material called cone, and we should probably save this. All of this is just some basic setup. Hopefully it's understandable. We'll call this video cone. The last thing, as I was saying, that you need to take care of is for this material, whatever material you're using to make our cone, make sure you go to the material settings, and under settings, go to displacement and make sure you either have displacement only or even better, displacement and bump. So before it was bump only means that whenever we plug something into the displacement socket, it wouldn't have done anything. So that's why we care. Okay, So how do we start off? What is this first part of making the cone about? Well, I thought an interesting way to divide these videos is by going over different features of the cone. So the first feature of a cone is kind of like the base of it, which is a rounded square. It's basically what is sitting on the cement or on the street or just on the floor in general. So we want to make the base of it, and then we'll work up to the circle and whatever else. So our first goal is making a rounded circle. Sorry, I hope I didn't say that twice, but a rounded square is what I meant. Hopefully I didn't say circle. Either way, our first goal is making a rounded square, which is kind of easy, but we want to make sure it's fully procedural, meaning we can change it on the fly even after the fact. So I guess the first part of making a rounded square is probably just making a square. So I'm going to start off with texture coordinates, and we can either use generated, UV, or object. It's kind of up to you. I prefer something with the origin at the center. So right now object coordinates has that. Alternatively, you could use something like scrolling to UV coordinates. Alternatively, you could use something like UV coordinates and then just displace them by minus 0.5, and then it will give us something fairly similar to object coordinates. We just need to scale it a bit. But anything with an origin in the center is good in my book. So I recommend object coordinates. Just use those. Okay. So now we have our object coordinates, and I'm going to separate them by x, y, and z. So as we look at x, you can see we have negative x values as we get to 0. And then as we progress up the x-axis, it goes to positive values. With y, it's vertical, and with z, we kind of just don't care. We don't care about this third dimension. Okay? And again, I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. For those of you who don't understand what's going on, the way I want you to think about this is we're going to look at where our x value is greater than this number, and you can see it's just sweeping from left to right. So really, this is just the x coordinate of our object where the origin is in the middle. Okay? So now we kind of have x-axis and y-axis, which is a two-dimensional kind of graphing situation. How do we make a square out of this? Well, there's a couple ways. The way I like, which is now the fastest, one of the fastest, used to have to do a bit more because the math node didn't have so many options. But nowadays we have something called compare. So I'm going to choose compare, and let's compare x. Let's compare x to 0 with some threshold. So I'll explain this in a second. You can see what this node basically does is it creates a stripe vertically that we can control the thickness of. Okay, why is this? Well, it's taking our x value and comparing it to 0. So x compared to 0, and this is our threshold. So we're saying how close is x to 0 within this threshold. If it's very small, then there will be only a very thin slice of values that actually satisfy this condition. If it's very large, then, once we get to 1, it actually fills up the whole thing. So you can kind of think of this as a radius in a kind of very cubic square sense. So again, is x within this threshold of the value? We're just comparing them. We can then duplicate this and do the same thing for our y, which think for yourself what would this look like when we view it. Well, it's going to look horizontal because now we're comparing y values, which makes it look like a horizontal stripe, and we can control it again. So if we want it to be a square, we kind of want to combine these, meaning that, first of all, we should use a value node or something like it to give the side length the same value, because a square has the same horizontal and vertical length. Otherwise, we'd have a rectangle. And then, to combine this region and this region, all we have to do is just add in another math node and set this to multiply. The way you want to think about this is that multiplication means and. So where do we have this and this at the same time? So what's the intersection? Well, it's only at the square, whereas something like addition, add, is saying or, which kind of looks like this. Yes, there's a stronger overlap in the middle, but it kind of gives us a cross. So it's the or for and versus and for multiply. Okay, so now we have a square that we can control the radius of. Alternatively, if we had these be independent, we'd have a rectangle, so we could control these axes individually. But we do like the fact that we can control the side length with a single value because it is a square. Okay, so let's say that for now we're going to choose 0.5 as our side length, or I guess it's kind of like half the side length because of the radius thing. Either way, or maybe it is the full thing. It doesn't matter. Either way, think about this as a radius, and I'm just going to give it that name. Okay, So now that we've made our square, the question is, how do we round the corners? I mean, the expression that we're using mathematically doesn't really have information about where the corners are, nor would we know how to round them. So let's try to take a different approach. So here's like one algorithm or one idea for how to do it. So imagine we took the square and added a circle at each corner. So one here, one here, one here, and one here. Well, it wouldn't really give us a rounded square because the circles are actually contained inside of here. It's getting us close, like it's putting the corners where we want them with this nice circle, but we still have this kind of sharp corner left over. So we want to do that with the circles, but we also want to cut into the shape first. So imagine that with this corner, we kind of cut away a square, and then we add in a circle. That would give us the nice rounded corner. So that's the idea we're going to go with. So first of all, how do we get rid of squares? How do we delete the corners? And then how do we add in circles? So for deleting the corners, we need to know the coordinates of each of these. Well, let's think about what the coordinates are. We know that the origin is right here. It's in the middle. It has coordinate 0, 0. And we know that this corner is this radius. In this case, it's 0.5 along the x and 0.5 along the y. So in this case, it's 0.5, 0.5. Now it is 0.67, 0.67. And in general, it's value, value. Over here, it's negative value, because we're going to the left, which is negative x, and then down, which is negative y. And then, you could keep going, like this top left is negative value for negative x, and then value, etc. Okay, so we kind of do know the coordinates. They're dependent on this. So let's try to make a square on each of these corners. And we can kind of repeat this node setup, but we just want to shift it up here. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, let's view our object coordinates. If we can take this origin and move it to the corner, and again, we'd have to do this for all four, but if we could take this origin and move it to the corner, that would be super useful, right? That's exactly what we want. Then we'd have the origin centered at where we want all the action to happen. Well, we can do that very simply by adding a vector math node, which is, this is addition of a vector, just translates everything essentially. So here I'm shifting the coordinate system on the x and the y. And we know that we want to translate everything by, at least the x and y, by this value right here. So we could either, this is kind of a tricky situation, you could either plug this in and it will like kind of do it. I guess you want to multiply by -1, so now we have the bottom left corner, but it's also manipulating the z coordinate because we've said use this value for x, y, and z. We kind of want to ignore that part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a combine x, y, z node. So instead of putting in our vector manually here, we could connect this and control it outside of the addition. And then we're just going to control x. Let me try that again. X and y. And again, this is the bottom left corner because it's kind of counterintuitive. You'd think that adding 0.5, 0.5 would shift it upwards, but rather it's saying this point was already -0.5, -0.5, and what happens when you add 0.5, 0.5? Well, it bounces out to 0. That's the origin. So it's kind of the opposite of what you'd think. Let me just make the opposite of the scenario. So before these values reach here, what we can do is put a math node in between, set it to multiply by -1, and now it will be up there. Okay. And then we could kind of repeat this node network from before. So let's literally do that. Let's just copy it, Shift D to do that. And now we're going to plug this in instead. So instead of, whoops, I've lost my nodes. I think button, yeah, that there's a couple hotkeys for recovering that. But what I was saying is instead of just bringing these object nodes directly into our square setup, we're bringing in the translated version. That's the idea. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So currently, what is this going to look like? Well, it's going to look like a square that is centered right here with a radius of 0.49, 0.49. And if we add in a value node, just like before, now it's a radius of a square centered there, we can now control this. Okay? So if we want to have this cut away from our original square, it's kind of obvious what we need to do. We take this square and subtract this square, right? We want to get rid of it. So how do we do that? We just take another math node, set it to subtract, and we want to subtract, we start off with this, and we want to subtract this away. So we'll just do that right here. And now you can see we've made a square with the corner kind of cut off, and we can control kind of the radius of that cutoff. Okay, cool. One more technical thing to think about before we kind of do this for all four or the three remaining corners is technically some of the square, especially the area up here, is kind of hanging off an area where there is no square here. Basically what I'm trying to say is when we subtract, we kind of get rid of the intersection, but some of this extra stuff over here is not just 0, but it's negative, because we took 0 and subtracted some of the remainder of the square. A nice way to visualize this is with a greater than node. So you can see this looks exactly the same, but if we go into the negative territory, we kind of have this hidden thing right here, which, we don't see because anything below 0 is just kind of set to black, but could mess up our displacement in the future. So to fix that, just enable clamp, and that will make sure that anything below 0 just gets sent to 0, right? It clamps it between 0 and 1. And now if we do a greater than and go under 0, it will just give us, everything. It will give us white because everything is bigger than a negative value currently because of clamping. Okay, so now the question is, do we need to kind of duplicate this and then each time use a different vector over here to get all the corners? That would be one way to do it, but not only would it be pretty computationally expensive because you'd be adding a lot of nodes, but it'd be messy and it would take a lot of time. So let me go over a trick that will help you quite a bit. So here's the coordinate system that we're using to do the thing. Really what we want to do is do the same trick for this corner and for this corner and for this corner. And a nice way to do that is notice that anything that isn't this top right area has the issue of being negative in some sense. So this black area is negative in x and negative in y. This area is negative in x. This area is negative in y. Basically what I'm saying is if we can somehow convert these areas to being entirely positive, then we'd have the exact same thing going on as this quadrant over here. And there's a name for this idea, and the name is absolute value. So vector math node, we set it to absolute value, if I can find it absolute. And I will be honest with you. I mean, we could logic it out, but I do always forget where it should be placed. So let's try to put it ahead. So that doesn't seem to really do what we want, right? We want this black dot, not only here, but in the other three corners. So it's definitely not that. And I'm thinking that what we need to do is put this probably before. So let's try that. There you go. If you think this out, it probably made sense, before trying it back and forth and all this. But the reason that this works is originally we have our object coordinates where, again, we have this quadrant idea where this is a positive quadrant and the other three have negative, components to them. If we take an absolute value, then they're all positive. And then when we shift them, it's kind of doing the thing everywhere. Okay, if you don't understand that, don't worry. Basically, the trick is absolute value gives us a nice four-way mirroring, kind of like a symmetry. And then if we view our squares, now we have them in all four quadrants. And really in all four corners, that's the thing. And we can control the radius, which means we're subtracting away this entire thing, which gives us this. So we've kind of made a procedural cross-generation. And you can see that now if we can somehow add in circles, like here and here, then it will look like we have rounded corners. Not really, we're just kind of taking a square, subtracting away squares, and then adding circles, but visually it does do exactly that. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we already know that we want to use this trick, this absolute value trick, to put a circle not only in this top right quadrant, but in the other four. So if we can focus on making a circle in the top right quadrant, all the rest of the work is already going to be done for us. So I say that we take our coordinate system here, this absolute value and shifted coordinate system, which looks like this, and let's use it to make a circle. There's a bunch of ways to do this. The easiest way, in my opinion, is using the length function, which when you input in vectors, because that's what this is, it outputs the size or magnitude or length of those vectors. And here's what it looks like. You can kind of see how this might already give us four circles. Basically, think about it as, let's only focus on the top right quadrant for now. So right here is where one of the origins were that we've kind of manipulated to be there. That's going to have a length of 0 because the vector is 0, 0, 0. Length of that is 0. And then as we go radially outward from that origin, it's going to give us a nice radial gradient. meaning we're kind of just mapping the radius in each of these quadrants, right? Because we did the mirror trick. If we muted this, then it would just look like that. And if we muted this, it would be in the center, is the idea. So let's unmute. So now to make this look like, circles, we could either, okay, there's two methods. You could either use a color ramp node, and I feel like this is a kind of short-sighted way of doing it, so you make this kind of crisp fall off. It works. However, not only is it very imprecise, because you're just kind of dragging handles, but we don't just want any circles, we want circles with the exact correct radius. Otherwise, when we put the circles on top of this, there will be some, we'll get the nice overlap, but we're going to get some areas of the circle that are outside of where we want, right? So our radius is already chosen for us. So how do we do this? Well, we can use a math node, since we've converted these vectors into values, because the length is just a number, it's not three-dimensional. And we're going to use something like either greater than or less than. So greater than is going to say where is the radius bigger than, in this case 0.5, and then we can manipulate that. And notice that the circles are black because anywhere in the interior has a radius smaller than this. And the radius, as you go inwards, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So obviously it's going to be smaller than 0.29 in this case. That's one way to do it. I'm going to use less than, which is just the inverse. It doesn't matter. You could have just done this and then use a invert node or something like it. Whatever you want. We're going to use less than. So less than. And again, we don't just want any value. And let me illustrate why. I've already explained it, but let me illustrate. So we want to take this and add our circles back in, which are already centered on the corners because of our nice setup from before. So let's just add, because we want this or this. And you can see, and again, make sure you have clamping, otherwise you're going to have some areas that have a value of 2 because we're taking a region with 1 and a region with 1 and adding them, which gives us 2. So just clamp that to make it uniform. You can see that these circles are way too big, and you could just kind of guess what the radius should be. Oh, by the way, we do need to shift them down. I did forget that. Maybe we should take care of that first, but either way, you do see the argument. The radius, in this case, is too big, and we'd kind of have to manipulate it to be just right. So let's take care of that shifting that I forgot to consider. So right now, these circles are centered where? They're centered at the corners of our original square. That's close to what we want, but instead we want them centered at kind of where, kind of the corner of where we cut it off, which is determined, remember, by this radius of these squares, right? This determines where the corners are. So we want this corner, etc. Well, I feel like it should be pretty obvious that all we need to do is manipulate our input coordinates. So I'm just going to duplicate these and feed this into what we had before, like this. And let's do that. So now we have 2 different variations. Let me get rid of that. I'm having trouble selecting this. We have one variation of our coordinate system, the absolute value in addition, going to our squares, and we have another variation of absolute value in addition going to our circles. So let's do what we had before. We're using the same vector that uses these, x and y values that we already explained why we're using. So currently this should give us the exact same thing as before, which almost gives us what we want, but again, the circles are in the wrong place, which is visible when we do this. So all we need to do is we need to manipulate what vector we're putting in here so it shifts correctly. So I'm going to do it by putting in another vector add node. I know it's getting messy right here. And you can see that we can kind of just manipulate these values until it's right. And here you can see why this actually looks like a rounded square once we get the positions right. But how do we get this exactly without guessing? Well, all we have to do is use another combine x, y, z. And this time, instead of using x and y from our square radius, we'll use it from our corner squares. I'll clean this up in a bit because it is getting crazy. So same as before, x, y, okay, which gives us what we want. However, again, these circles aren't big enough, and they should imagine that they're centered here. They're centered, it's getting confusing. They're centered at the corner of this of this cutout. This is where they're centered. Well, how big should they be? They should have a radius of this length, right? And that would give us a nice perfect circle. Well, we actually already know this value, and that is this one. So 0.08. 0.08. So we take this, we plug it in here, we view it, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And you might be thinking, okay, that was a lot of work. I could have just moved stuff manually and eyeballed it until it made sense. Well, look at it this way. Look at it this way. We have two parameters. One of them is the radius, and I guess I should specify. We'll call this main radius. Or maybe we should just call it side length, really, because it's referring to the original square. And we'll call this one rounding, because it's referring to the radius of our circles, and it also positions them in the correct spot, which looks like rounding. So here's what I want you to consider. We have one slider that changes the side length, and the circles, notice, are staying in the correct spot, and the rounding works as well. If we make our rounding big enough, it will look like a circle, and if we make it small enough, it will look like a square. And all of this works together. You could have made these independent from each other, this one and this one, so you can get a rounded rectangle instead of a square, but in this case, we have a much simpler situation. And remember, we kind of got lost in the weeds here. Remember, the idea here is we wanted to make a nice procedural base for our cone. So a cone kind of looks something like, it doesn't have this much rounding, more like something like this, and with our, our generator, it's basically a generator. With our generator for rounded squares, we can now create any base for a cone that we want. And let me just give you a sneak peek about what we can do with this. First of all, let's do a bit of cleanup. Don't worry about the fact that this is a mess, because honestly, we never need to touch any of this. The only things we care about are these red things, these inputs, because that's what we'd be manipulating. So just drag everything that isn't red into a clump, and then you could either, select all and then Control G, which puts them in a nice node group. And that's probably the better way to do it. Or you could just hit Shift P to put them in a frame. I'm going to go with Control G to put them in a node group, which we can move closer. So now it's, it's still the same thing going on, but it's a lot simpler. And we can always control using these, or alternatively, you could just use this stuff built right into the node. But I think for simplicity's sake, we'll just keep the same setup from before. Okay, so I want to show you one more thing before we wrap up part one, which I feel like was pretty intense. But again, it's hard to explain this stuff at a beginner level because it's very mathematical. But remember, we set up all our displacement stuff. Let's actually see what this looks like with displacement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to view this with a diffuse BSDF. And for our displacement, we're just going to use a displacement node, hook that up, and then, by the way, set mid-level to 0 so it's not like offset at all. What should our height be for our displacement? I'll give you a hint. This is our height, meaning black is 0, meaning a height of 0, don't change it, and 1, or white, is a height of 1. So we can just put that here. And let's view it with our diffuse BSDF. Okay, so a couple things. First of all, it looks a bit glitchy, especially in the corners, and this is just because it's procedural, meaning that the amount of detail that we're going to see, how smooth this corner is going to be, is directly dependent on how much geometry we have. So if we take our dicing scale and make it smaller, you can see this gets nice and rounder. You could go down to 0.2. This is going to become more and more computationally expensive as you continue, but you kind of just want to set this to a very small number on render. For now, we're just viewing it. And the second thing is that the effect of this is very large, right? A cone isn't this tall, the base of it. We can either control this with the scale to make it smaller, but that's not really what we want because we'd rather keep this at 1 since we're going to be feeding more than just this into our height. So we want to keep this normalized. So what I recommend is just using something like a math node and then just multiplying it before it even reaches height. So that's one way to do it. And let's actually change our lighting to an HDRI just so we can see what's going on a bit better. So I'm just going to use a free HDRI that I have from HDRI Haven or something. Something with a bit of contrast. I like that. And let's hide that with film transparent. Okay. So again, we can return to our nodes, which I always lose. We want to make this even, not as tall. And if anything, you could just make a value node. So right now it's like 0.13. And then connect this, and now we actually have another parameter for the height of our cone. So you can see how all of this is building very procedurally. So let me call this base height, just like that. Okay, and again, to make this smoother, we just bring this down, and I think this level also helps, but again, it will make everything a bit slower. So I just recommend making it very smooth on render time. And by the way, for you experts out there who want a good way to solve this without just increasing the resolution, or decreasing dicing scale, which increases the resolution, a good solution is, instead of having a very harsh map that goes from, let me view this from the top and remove displacement, that goes from black to white immediately. If you could have a bit of a gradient, a bit of a fall off, there will be a nice transition for the geometry to catch up with the boundary. So hopefully professionals, experts know what I'm talking about right there. That's just an advanced solution. But for now, this is actually fine. And if you look at a cone, the base of a cone, it is pretty straight. There's a bit of curvature, but this is at least a reasonable approximation. So I think this is a good place to leave off this part of making the cone. Thank you for watching part 1 of this advanced procedural stuff. I just wanted to end off with this before I actually end the video. If you want to support this channel and everything I do, and you like these tutorials and you want to get benefits, the best way to do that is via my Patreon. You're going to get exclusive video tutorials if you get a certain tier. You can get project files. You can get a whole bunch of other stuff. But in general, it's just a very, very nice way to support me and these tutorials if that's something you want to do. And yeah, Patreon promotion at the very end. I'm serious about it. It is the only reason I can do YouTube full time. So thank you, everybody who wants to do that. Enjoy part 2 when it comes out. There might be a day or two delay.